It has been 5 years since we saw the dynamic duo of Ratchet & Clank. In that time, Sony purchased Insomniac Games and they've created 2 Spider-Man titles. To say that I was hyped for this action platformer would be a massive understatement. Boasting super fast load times, beautiful visuals and frantic gameplay, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is the 2 pals' first outing on next-gen hardware, and is the only first-party PS5 exclusive to date. But how does Rift Apart play on the PlayStation 5? Is it a worthy entry in the long legacy of our Lombax and robot pals? And is the Rift mechanic all it's cracked up to be? Let's find out. The opening is a love letter to this amazing franchise, with a parade being held for the heroic acts of Ratchet & Clank. I was instantly blown away by the fidelity, running at a smooth ray trace 4K 30 FPS. I know it's a cliche at this point, but it really does feel like playing a Pixar movie. I was reminded of the nostalgic memories many of us have with this series, and I could not help but smile from ear to ear. But of course, the festivities soon come to an end, as none other than Dr. Nefarious rears his ugly head to spoil the fun. With the Dimensionator in tow, Nefarious doesn't take too long before all hell breaks loose and Ratchet & Clank are separated, leading them on an intergalactic wild goose chase to put a stop to the all too persistent Dr. Nefarious, involving lots of explosions, rail grinding and interdimensional rift travel. From the densely populated neon streets of Coruscant 5 to the lush and treacherous swamps of Sargassum, the level of detail is a true testament to the power of the PlayStation 5 and the talent at Insomniac. Nefarious City feels alive as you sweep through its detailed alleyways and jump from rooftop to rooftop, all the while being blinded by neon signs. It's the small details like moss-covered boxes in the swamp levels and how enemies interact with each other before you engage them in combat that truly adds to the experience. Each subsequent level brings a certain level of beauty to the table, and at times I had to stop and take in the sights, before quickly returning to wreaking havoc on the enemies that stood in my way. Once again, Insomniac showed the true power of ray tracing in how the light reflects off the many polished surfaces, and I can't forget Clank's shiny exterior. In-game cutscenes were breathtaking, and the all-important voice cast of James Arnold Taylor and David Kay return to voice Ratchet & Clank, which are as iconic as ever. I was itching to see what the next cutscene had in store, and it is great to see Insomniac's brand of comedy return in its full glory.
If only that blasted Dimensionator still worked.
Clank.
Huh?
This has the darkest tone of the whole series, with some of the most dire locations seen in the franchise. Even the first few levels feature entire populations in peril from the actions of Dr. Nefarious. A ragtag group of resistance fighters with a sprinkling of light-hearted moments and high stakes reminded me of the original Star Wars trilogy, even going as far as the Star Wars inspired screen transitions. In the relatively short runtime of 10 hours, the story was well paced and the interactions between characters were believable, with comedy and touching moments throughout. New and old characters alike feel well developed. Rivet was not just a counterpart to Ratchet, she has her own backstory which shapes her personality and sets her apart from Ratchet. Being a Ratchet & Clank game, there are certain things we've come to expect, such as explosive combat, wacky weapons and a wide variety of enemies and unique boss encounters. And I'm happy to say Rift Apart mostly delivers on these fronts. The moment-to-moment gameplay is nothing short of fantastic, even if it doesn't deviate far from the formula. Utilising an arsenal of weapons to annihilate a whole host of enemies will never get old, especially when you hear the cling of bolts soon to follow. There are a myriad of enemies to fight, planets to explore and weapons to use. Fan favourite weapons return like the Glove of Doom and Buzzblades, but the new weapons are where the game really excels. I had 17 weapons at the end of my first playthrough, with the majority being brand new. My favourite is the Negatron Collider, a gigantic charged laser beam that decimates the enemies. And the second being the Black Hole Storm, which is a heavy machine gun that has to spool up before it can shoot. Unlike some weapons in the past games, everyone here feels viable. I thoroughly enjoyed leveling each of them up and didn't feel like there was any weak links in Ratchet and Rivet's arsenal. The bolt economy is well balanced too. If you explore the levels, kill most enemies and find most boxes, you'll be able to afford all the weapons by the time the credits roll, which is something previous titles have struggled with. Raritanium makes a return and it works the exact same way that it did in Ratchet 2016. Even though the upgrades aren't anything unique, mostly increased ammo, range and damage, there are a couple like the ability to deploy 2 Mr. Fungi that improve the weapon drastically. This skill tree clicks with me. It made searching for Raritanium crates that much more rewarding. The movement has been significantly improved from previous entries in the series. Both Ratchet and Rivet have hover boots that they can use to zoom around the levels either on the ground or wall running. In addition, there are rifts littered throughout the world that act as grapple points, pulling that part of the world towards you. Initially, I was blown away by this gimmick, and used them plenty during combat, but I quickly realised that they're not very useful during firefights, and just take you out of the action for a few seconds. Even while exploring the levels, they only acted as grapple points, and once the novelty of instantaneous loading wore off, I was over them. The rifts were featured heavily in the footage leading up to launch, so it's a little disappointing that they're not better utilised, perhaps by rewarding the player with different buffs like extra bolts or increased damage for 10 seconds after using them. Another major addition is the dash, a much needed mechanic in the Ratchet series. I found it was implemented well when exploring and platforming, though I rarely used it during combat, as enemy attacks didn't incentivise it save for 1 or 2 boss attacks. And speaking of bosses, I was quite disappointed with these. There are only a handful of true bosses, with the rest being mini-bosses, most of which were oversized goons or creatures that had very little personality. As a series, even the mini-bosses looked great and usually had interesting fights, but I was underwhelmed by them in Rift Apart. Levels in general feel more open than usual. With side objectives, areas and collectibles to find, you'll be spending a fair bit of time in each level if you want to 100% the game. With the new movement system, there were more options at my disposal for exploration, and it made it all the more rewarding when I finally figured out how to find that hidden gold bolt. The rewards for finding the bolts are amusing, throwing me back to the original titles on PS2 with big head mode and skins for Ratchet's Omni Wrench and Rivet's hammer. My favourite of all the side objectives were the hidden platforming challenges. In these, there was typically a challenge like platforming only on explosive boxes that added a nice variety to the gameplay, even though they were a little on the short side. The reward for completing these were interesting costumes, some of which are throwbacks like the Galactic Ranger costume from Ratchet Clank 2016. There are 2 other types of gameplay. Of course, a Ratchet Clank game would feel empty without the Clank puzzle sections. I'm terrible at puzzles, but these offered a good level of difficulty, where the game made me feel smart for completing them, but I was never bored or frustrated trying to figure them out. The other sections are hacking minigames involving a cute little robot called Glitch. The mechanics involved here aren't anything to write home about, but they decided to give Glitch her own story and character arc. This is a nice little touch that added so much to a rather boring section of the game. For the less puzzle inclined, both of these sections can be skipped entirely with no penalty. I never felt that the series had any standout tracks, and it's the same here. The music lends itself well to the atmosphere, never getting in the way, but also not standing out from the crowd. It's not all sunshine and roses, however, as I ran into a few technical issues. The main culprit was enemies getting stuck on the terrain or behind doors, leading me to restart the checkpoint. The issue arose 3 times across my playthrough. There was another hiccup where Ratchet would get caught in the terrain doing the falling animation. In most instances this would fix itself, but once again I had to restart the checkpoint a few times. It's nice to see that there are no glaring issues. As for performance modes, you have 2 options. Performance mode, which runs at dynamic 4K 60fps, and Performance RT mode, which runs at 4K 60fps with ray tracing, much like Insomniac Spider-Man Miles Morales. This was enabled near the tail end of the review process, so I played an hour of these modes. I tried out the most hectic combat scenarios, and I'm happy to report that there were no noticeable frame drops in either mode. Performance RT mode will be my preferred graphic setting for my second playthrough. Here's a quick comparison of the 2 modes. Unfortunately, the DualSense implementation left a lot to be desired, especially fresh off the release of Returnal. Each weapon has its own form of haptics, most of which give the triggers 2 functions. For instance, the Executor, this game's shotgun, shoots a single blast with a half press of R2 and 2 rapid fire blasts with a full press of R2. In these instances, the haptics were a nice addition, however it didn't feel as smooth as the haptics in Returnal. I eventually turned them off as I had some cramping in my fingers after long play sessions. Luckily, Rift Apart has plenty of accessibility options, from visual options like different colour shaders on objects of interest, enemies and things like that, to a variety of control options like binding multiple actions to one button, or changing whether you have to toggle, press or hold to shoot your gun. There are also 4 different difficulty options, all of which can be changed on the fly. This is a great feature set that Sony seems to be pushing with their first party titles, so let's hope it continues in the future. Plain and simple, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is a ton of fun. The act of smashing crates, collecting bolts and upgrading your weapons is better than it has ever been. Similar to Ratchet & Clank 2016, it transported me back to when I was a kid, all the while feeling like a modern iteration of the tried and true formula. The variety of weapons is some of the best in the franchise's 19-year history, and the sprawling and lively levels make the journey feel even more epic than ever before. The lack of boss fights was disappointing, but I quickly forgot about this issue once I was thrown back into the action, especially with how the new movement system makes Ratchet control better than he has ever before. As much as I love the existing characters, the new addition to the cast are great and fit well into the universe. If you're not already a fan of the franchise, then I can't see there being much to persuade you, but for those who are, then there is no better example for the heights this series has reached than Rift Apart, and that's why I love it. Thanks for watching our review on Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. I would love to know if you plan on picking it up in the comments down below. Make sure to subscribe to GameXplain for more reviews and check out the videos on the right. I'll see you all next time.